What if a sound could erase you? A hidden signal in a meditation app designed not to calm the mind, but to delete it. Its creator calls it a cure for the trauma of memory, a path to peace. But is a person still a person without their past? Is a painless existence worth the price of your own soul? When the science is this terrifying, the only question left is what it means to be human. The world of Dr. Lena Hanson was a world of clean lines and verifiable data. It existed within the humming, climate-controlled walls of the CDC's mobile hazmat laboratory, a rolling bastion of reason currently parked on the shoulder of a dusty Oregon highway. Inside, everything was chrome and antiseptic white. Outside, the world was a haze of sun-bleached asphalt and wilting pines. Lena preferred it in here. Here, the universe was meant to make sense. On her primary monitor, a dozen MRI scans of human brains were arranged in a neat grid. She stared at them, her sharp, tired eyes scanning the delicate grey structures of the hippocampus, the frontal lobe, the amygdala. They were perfect. Textbook. No lesions, no swelling, no signs of ischemic damage. They were the scans of healthy, functioning people, which was precisely the problem. With a precise, economical movement, she swiped a finger across the tablet in her other hand, scrolling through columns of numbers that represented the very building blocks of life in Havenwood, Oregon. Air quality particulates, nominal. Municipal water analysis, pristine. Heavy metal screens on the first 50 patients, negative. Full toxicology panels on the first 20, clean. CBC, metabolic, viral, bacterial. Every test, every single metric she had to measure the physical world, had come back with the same infuriating answer. Nothing. Nothing was wrong. Lena ran a hand through her tightly bound hair, the gesture a rare crack in her professional composure. For 72 hours, she had been chasing a ghost, an outbreak with no pathogen, a mass poisoning with no toxin. Hundreds of people in the isolated town below had simply stopped being themselves. And her science, the only tool she trusted to navigate the chaos of existence, was failing her. She leaned forward, the sterile light of the monitor illuminating the weary lines around her eyes. She zoomed in on one of the scans, tracing the elegant curve of a temporal lobe, searching for the microscopic clue she must have missed. But there was nothing. No cause, just the effect. No pathogen, she muttered to the silent humming machines. No toxin, nothing. The van door hissed open, and the dry, pine-scented air felt like an intrusion. Stepping out onto the cracked pavement of Havenwood's Main Street was like stepping onto a meticulously crafted film set moments after the director had yelled, "Cut!" and everyone had walked off, forgetting to turn off a few of the extras. The town was beautiful in a postcard sort of way. Old brick storefronts, cheerful flower boxes, a white steepled church at the far end of the street. But it was silent, not peaceful silent. It was the unnerving, profound silence of a place that had forgotten its own purpose. People were present, but they were not there. A man in a flannel shirt stood on his porch, methodically sweeping the same patch of clean-painted wood, his strokes rhythmic and utterly pointless. A woman in a floral dress diligently watered a window box full of plastic petunias, the water trickling down the brick facade in sad, muddy rivulets. They moved without intent, their faces placid and vacant, their eyes looking at nothing. They were like wind-up toys slowly winding down. Lena's training screamed at her to maintain professional distance, to observe and record. But the sheer, quiet strangeness of it pulled her forward. She approached a man standing before the post office. He held a letter in his hand, patiently trying to push it through the mail slot, which had been painted shut years ago. His knuckles were raw. "Excuse me, sir," Lena said, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. The man stopped, turning to her with a gentle, unfocused smile. His eyes were a pleasant blue, but there was no depth to them, no recognition. "I'm Dr. Hanson with the Centers for Disease Control," she said. "I'm here to help. Can you tell me your name?" He looked at the letter in his hand, as if seeing it for the first time. He looked back at her, his smile faltering slightly into a look of mild, untroubled confusion. "I should know that, shouldn't I?" he said, his voice soft. He wasn't distressed. He wasn't even particularly curious. It was a simple statement of fact, an observation about a piece of data that was no longer accessible. He then turned back to the painted shut mail slot and resumed his gentle, fruitless task. Lena felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. This wasn't a disease of the body, it was an erasure of the self. The Havenwood Sheriff's Office was a small brick building, struggling to contain a very large problem. Maps of the town and surrounding county were pinned to every wall, crisscrossed with coloured string and desperate handwritten notes. Stacks of missing persons forms, useless since no one was missing, just empty, teetered on the corners of desks. In the middle of it all stood Sheriff Grant Wallace, a man whose kind, weathered face was etched with the strain of a man watching his entire world dissolve into fog. He handed Lena a mug of black coffee. It was bitter and scalped her tongue. "It started 3 days ago," he said, his voice raspy with exhaustion. He gestured to a large whiteboard, the only organized space in the room. It was a grid listing names, ages, occupations, and a dozen other variables. First, it was the Miller family down on Oak Street, then old Mr. Abernathy, the hardware store owner. By yesterday morning, it was almost everyone. Lena scanned the board. There was no pattern. Not by age, not by diet, not by social circle or workplace. Farmers and teachers, teenagers and retirees. The only commonality was their shared geography and their shared sudden vacancy. "There's no panic," Wallace continued, running a hand over his tired face. "No violence, no fear. That's the spooky part. They just stop. They can eat if you put food in front of them. They can walk around, but everything that made them is just gone." He stared at the board, at the names of people he'd known his entire life. "I've been a cop for 30 years, Doctor. I've seen some terrible things. But this..." He shook his head, struggling for a word that fit. He looked at Lena, his eyes pleading for an explanation she didn't have. "It's like someone reached in and just deleted them." Lena flinched at the word. It was unscientific. It was emotional. It was a metaphor for something she needed to define in precise, clinical terms. But as she stood there in the quiet, overwhelmed office, staring at the names of the erased, she couldn't escape the chilling accuracy of the sheriff's description. Something had come to Havenwood, and it had pressed delete. The Havenwood High School gymnasium smelled of antiseptic and quiet despair. Rows of cots, borrowed from the Red Cross, filled the basketball court, each one occupied by a ghost. These were the townspeople, the ones too frail or too disconnected to be left on their own. They didn't cry out. They didn't complain. They simply existed, breathing in and breathing out, their inner worlds scraped clean. Dr. Lena Hanson moved between them, her face illuminated by the cold blue light of a tablet. It was well past midnight. She was drawing blood from a teenage girl, whose vacant eyes were fixed on the ceiling. The only sound the girl made was a soft, continuous hum, a simple, 3-note melody repeated over and over again. It was the same tune she'd heard from at least a dozen other patients, a mindless hymn for the forgotten. Propped up on a nearby medical case, a laptop screen showed the face of Dr. Mark Bellamy, her superior back in Atlanta. His expression was a familiar mix of impatience and condescension. "Lena, we need a plausible vector," he said, his voice tinny through the laptop speakers. "Start retesting the reservoir. Look for agricultural runoff, a fungal spore, something tangible." "The data isn't there, Mark," Hanson said, her voice low but firm. She expertly slid the needle from the girl's arm and pressed a cotton ball to the spot. The girl didn't even flinch. "I've run every panel twice: air, water, soil, blood. Every test on every conceivable vector is negative. There is no environmental cause." "Then you're missing something," Bellamy snapped. "A chemical agent can be subtle. Go back to the basics. Stick to the protocol." Lena looked from Bellamy's scowling, pixelated face to the humming girl on the cot. The protocol was failing. The basics were useless. As she labeled the vial of blood, her eyes caught on something out of place. On the girl's bedside table, next to a half-empty glass of water, sat a brand new smartphone, the kind with a price tag that felt deeply incongruous in a town like Havenwood. Its sleek black surface was a stark contrast to the worn-out surroundings. She scanned the gymnasium. A few beds down, an elderly man had the same model of phone. So did the woman in the cot across from him. It was a pattern, hiding in plain sight, not biological, but technological. The next morning, Lena sought refuge in the one place in Havenwood that still felt tethered to the world of reason and memory, the town library. It was a quiet, sunlit space that smelled of old paper and wood polish. Behind the main desk sat Evelyn Reed, the town librarian. She was a woman in her 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes that had missed nothing. She was one of the few who remained untouched. "A contagion, Doctor," Evelyn said, pushing a pair of reading glasses up on her nose. "No, I don't think so. A sickness of the body has symptoms. A fever, a cough. This is a sickness of the spirit." Lena felt a familiar prickle of skepticism. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I deal in viruses, not spirits." "Of course," Evelyn said with a wry smile. "But you also deal in patterns, don't you? Tell me, did you find any common link in your blood work?" Lena's silence was answer enough. "I didn't think so, because the link isn't in their blood, it's in their hands." Evelyn leaned forward, her voice dropping conspiratorially. "About a month ago, a new wellness craze swept through this town. It was an app, a meditation app called Clarity. Everyone was talking about it, said it helped them sleep, calmed their nerves. My nephew tried to get me to download it, said it would declutter my mind." She gave a short, dry laugh. "I told him my mind was quite happily cluttered. Thank you very much." She pointed out the library window. "This town has one cell tower and Wi-Fi that cuts out if a strong wind blows. And yet, almost overnight, nearly every single person downloaded this one specific app. Does that sound like a natural pattern to you, Doctor?" Lena felt a jolt of recognition. The phones. The high-end, identical phones. "They were given the phones," she said, more to herself than to Evelyn. "Part of a promotional wellness initiative," Evelyn confirmed, her eyes glinting. "Free phone, free app. All you had to do was sign up." She reached under her desk and produced a glossy, folded flyer, its design minimalist and sleek. In the center was a simple, elegant logo, a stylized cyan sound wave. Someone wanted everyone in this town to have this. They made it very, very easy. That night, the only light inside the mobile lab came from the screen of the phone Lena had borrowed from the humming girl in the gym. It felt alien in her hand, a cold, smooth rectangle of glass and metal that held the key to everything. With a few taps, she navigated to the app. Clarity. Its icon was the same cyan sound wave from the flyer. She opened it. The interface was seamless, almost sterile. There were no ads, no clutter, just a simple welcome screen and a list of audio tracks. The river, the forest, the stillness. A line of text at the bottom of the screen pulsed gently. True quiet is not the absence of sound, but the absence of self. She tapped on the About section. The description was a meaningless word salad of corporate wellness speak, promising to optimize mental states and declutter the mind using proprietary neurosyncing audio. It was pseudoscience, dressed up in the language of technology. But it had worked. Her hands felt cold. Every instinct, every year of her training, screamed at her not to do this. This was not a controlled experiment. This was not data. This was anecdotal evidence and a wild hypothesis. Bellamy's voice echoed in her head. Stick to the protocol. But the protocol was a dead end. Science had given her nothing. The only path forward was through the looking glass. With a deep, steadying breath, she picked up a pair of noise-cancelling headphones and plugged them into the phone. She scrolled back to the main menu and her finger hovered over the primary meditation track. the one Evelyn said everyone was using. The stillness. She put the headphones on, sealing herself in a world of absolute silence. Her own heartbeat was a dull thud in her ears. She looked at the hypnotic, pulsing cyan sound wave on the screen. This was an experiment with a sample size of 1. A reckless, unscientific, desperate leap in the dark. She pressed play. A low, pulsing hum began to fill her ears. It was more a feeling than a sound. A deep, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the center of her own skull. On the screen, the cyan wave undulated in perfect time with the beat, a digital serpent charming its way into her mind. The binaural beat was a physical presence in the void of the headphones. For a few seconds, it was just that, a low, rhythmic pulse that seemed to vibrate directly against her eardrums. Lena Hanson, the scientist, waited for a measurable effect, a change in heart rate, a spike in blood pressure. She glanced at the biometric readings on her smartwatch. All stable, all normal. Then the change came. Not to her body, but to her mind. A wave of profound calm washed over her, a placidity so deep it felt synthetic. It was not the gentle quiet of meditation. It was the sterile silence of a padded room. Her thoughts, usually a rapid-fire sequence of analysis and hypothesis, began to slow down, thickening like honey. The sharp edges of her intellect felt soft, dulled. She turned her head, her movements feeling sluggish and detached, and looked at the large whiteboard mounted on the lab wall. It was her brain, externalized, a chaotic masterpiece of chemical formulas, epidemiological pathways, and complex data sets, all written in her own precise hand. It was the map of the problem she was trying to solve. But as she stared at it, the symbols began to lose their meaning. The elegant language of science, the bedrock of her reality, dissolved into a meaningless scrawl of foreign characters. For a terrifying, eternal moment, she could not understand her own notes. Panic, sharp and cold, sliced through the artificial calm. With a strangled gasp, she tore the headphones from her head, throwing them onto the console as if they were venomous. The lab's low, ambient hum rushed back in, a welcome anchor to reality. She was breathing heavily, her heart now hammering against her ribs. The syrupy feeling in her head began to recede, the fog lifting. She looked back at the whiteboard, and with a wave of relief that left her weak, the equations and formulas snapped back into focus. They were familiar again. They were hers. She checked her vitals. Pulse, 120. Blood pressure, elevated. Both easily explained by a sudden jolt of fear. There was no physical trace of what had just happened. No biological marker. The event had occurred entirely within the subjective space of her consciousness. She now possessed a single, terrifying piece of data that she could never prove, never measure, and never show to anyone. The app worked, and it was rewriting the human mind. The next day, Lena didn't leave the lab. The sun rose and set outside the van's small window, but her world was the blue glow of her laptop screen. She was no longer investigating a phenomenon. She was investigating a man. Alistair Finch. His digital footprint was vast and meticulously curated. He was the founder of Clarity, a tech guru spoken of in the hushed, reverent tones usually reserved for spiritual leaders. Lena bypassed the hagiographic articles in tech magazines and pulled up a video of his latest keynote speech. The man who appeared on her screen was in his 40s, with a charismatic smile and eyes that seemed to hold a universe of serene certainty. He wore a simple cream-colored tunic and stood on a bare stage, bathed in a soft, welcoming light. He didn't use slides or teleprompters. He just spoke. His voice was a masterpiece of hypnotic modulation, weaving together the language of neuroscience, Eastern philosophy, and New Age wellness. He spoke of the human condition not as something to be celebrated, but as a flaw to be corrected. "We are slaves to our past," Finch said, his hands clasped gently before him. "Every decision, every fear is a ghost of a memory. We are haunted houses, each of us. But what if you could open the windows? What if you could let the ghosts out? What if you could declutter? We believe memory is not sacred. It is scar tissue. And our technology is not an app. It is a cure for the disease of the past. We are not offering a product. We are offering a pure state of being. Lena felt a profound sense of revulsion. This was the rhetoric of a cult leader, the seductive promise of a clean slate. He was a charlatan of the highest order, wrapping a dangerous, invasive ideology in the comforting blanket of self-help. He wasn't selling an app. He was selling salvation to the vulnerable, and the town of Havenwood was his first congregation. Night fell again. Fueled by coffee and a cold, rising anger, Lena went back to work. She was done with the philosophy. She needed the weapon. She managed to isolate the core audio file from the Clarity app, the track titled The Stillness. It was a simple, uncompressed wave file. To the ear, it was nothing more than the low, pulsing hum she'd already experienced. But she knew there was more to it. She loaded the file into a deep spectrum audio analysis program, a powerful piece of software that could visualize sound in all its complexity. The program's interface filled her monitor. She hit Analyze. At first, the display showed exactly what she expected: two clean, gently oscillating lines representing the simple binaural tones. It was innocuous, deceptive, but her instincts told her to look deeper. She began to filter out the audible frequencies, peeling back the layers of the sound like an onion, searching for something hidden underneath. And then she saw it. As she pushed the filter down into the sub-20 Hz range, the very bottom of the spectrum, below the threshold of human hearing, a new signal flickered into existence on the screen. It was not a simple wave. It was a complex, tightly structured pulse, a lattice of geometric patterns encoded in pure, inaudible frequency. It was a carrier wave, piggybacking on the simple, audible beat. It was beautiful, intricate, and utterly horrifying. Lena leaned closer, her breath fogging the screen. She ran a diagnostic, cross-referencing the signal's pattern with a neurological database. The computer spat out the answer in a fraction of a second, but for Lena, time seemed to slow to a crawl as she read the words. The embedded frequency was a perfect match for the specific brainwave pattern that induced the delta state, the state of deep, dreamless, unconscious sleep. But the audible binaural beat was designed to keep the user awake and receptive. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a trick of the mind. It was a command, delivered directly to the brain's operating system. It was forcing the cerebral cortex into a waking coma, gently and quietly, shutting down the complex functions of memory and identity while the user sat there, placid and calm. She pushed her chair back from the console, a cold sweat on her brow. Her own scientific methods had given her the answer, and the answer was more terrifying than any supernatural explanation could ever be. "It's not hypnosis," she whispered to the silent, humming lab. "It's a neurological override." The sun was high and bright over Havenwood, but for Lena Hanson, the world had gone dark. She stood beside her mobile lab, the pristine white of the van a stark contrast to the dust on her boots, and stared at the face of Dr. Bellamy on her tablet. She had just laid out her discovery, the hidden signal, the neurological override, the scientific anatomy of the weapon that was consuming this town. She had given him the evidence, hard data pulled from the audio file itself. She had called it weaponized psychoacoustics. She had termed the resulting condition digital encephalopathy. She was giving a name to the monster, defining its claws and teeth in the precise language of science. And in response, Bellamy stared back at her with an expression of profound disappointment. "Weaponized psychoacoustics?" he repeated, the words dripping with scorn. "Lena, are you listening to yourself? You're talking about a sound file that makes people forget. That's not a diagnosis. It's the plot of a bad movie." "The spectral analysis is conclusive, Mark," Lena insisted, her voice tight with a frustration that was nearing its breaking point. "The carrier wave is there. The frequency matches the delta state pattern. This isn't a theory. It's a mechanism. Show me the peer-reviewed precedents, Bellamy shot back. Show me a single credible study on digital encephalopathy. You can't, because it doesn't exist. You've been in an isolated, high-stress environment. You've admitted to subjecting yourself to the stimulus. Frankly, I'm concerned you've become emotionally compromised. Your judgment is compromised. The accusation hung in the air, a stunning bureaucratic betrayal. She was being treated not as the lead investigator, but as a hysterical victim. "So you want me to ignore the only lead we have?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "I want you to stick to the protocol," he ordered, his face hardening. "Continue to look for an environmental agent. That's the official directive. If you are unable to follow it, I will have you replaced. Am I clear?" The call ended. Lena stood in the silent street, the tablet in her hand suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. She was alone. Her own people, the institution to which she had dedicated her life, had just branded her a heretic. The dogma of science, with its rigid insistence on precedent, was now actively obstructing the discovery of a new threat. The establishment wasn't just failing to help, it was now an antagonist. Night in the mobile lab was a cocoon of defiance. If the CDC wouldn't act, she would. With information fed to her by Evelyn from the library's public records, corporate filings, investor reports, Lena was attempting to do what she had never been trained for. She was trying to break into Alistair Finch's digital kingdom, the central server for the Clarity app. It was a fortress. Every port she scanned was shielded. Every firewall she tested was a seamless, impenetrable wall of code. It was the work of a genius, designed not just to keep people out, but to give the impression that there was nothing there to begin with. She worked for hours, lines of code flying across her screen, her mind locked in a silent battle with Finch's invisible architect. Finally, she found a crack. A diagnostic subroutine, an old piece of code likely forgotten, that gave her a potential backdoor. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, exploiting the opening. A progress bar appeared on her screen. She was getting in. Then her screen went black, a dead, silent black that absorbed all the light in the small lab. Lena froze, her hands hovering over the keyboard. A single pulsing cyan sound wave bloomed in the center of the monitor, identical to the one in the app. It pulsed in time with her own frantic heartbeat. A voice came through her laptop speakers. It was not Finch's warm, charismatic speaking voice. It was a cold, perfectly synthesized version, devoid of all emotion. "You cannot measure the soul, Doctor," the voice said. "You should stop trying." The sound wave vanished. Her laptop was dead. The connection was severed. Before she could even process the violation, a new sound began, not from her laptop, but from outside. It was a high-frequency, piercing shriek, impossibly loud, coming from all directions at once. It was the sound of every phone in Havenwood emitting a single, deafening tone in perfect unison. It lasted for 10 agonizing seconds, drilling into her skull, a raw assertion of power. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped, leaving behind a ringing, profound silence. Finch was no longer just a ghost in the machine. He knew she was there, and he was showing her, and the entire town, just how complete his control really was. The radio on her console crackled to life. It was Sheriff Wallace, his voice tight with panic. "Lena, are you there? Something's happening." At the gym, Lena was already moving, grabbing a flashlight and her medical kit, her heart pounding with a new and terrible dread. She burst out of the van and ran toward the high school, the echo of that piercing tone still ringing in her ears. Inside the gymnasium, the scene was one of quiet, ordered horror. The townspeople, who had been lying placidly on their cots just minutes before, were now all sitting up. Then, as if guided by a single, invisible hand, they stood. Their random, aimless shuffling was gone. Their movements were now synchronized, deliberate. They turned, all of them, to face the gymnasium's large double doors, and then they began to walk. They flowed out of the building in a silent, orderly procession. From the houses and storefronts all along Main Street, others emerged, joining the stream. Men, women, children, all moving with the same steady, unthinking purpose. Their faces were as blank as ever, but now their bodies had a mission. They were an army of puppets, their strings pulled by an unseen master. Lena stood frozen on the steps of the gym, watching the silent tide of people move past her. The radio on her hip crackled again. It was Wallace, his voice breaking. "They're all heading the same way. All of them. They're going up the hill." He paused, his breath catching in a sob of disbelief. "My God, Lena. They're all walking to the old radio tower." Back in the humming sanctuary of the mobile lab, the chaos outside coalesced into a single, terrible point of clarity in Lena Hanson's mind. The piercing tone, the synchronized march. It wasn't magic, it was physics. "He's turned their phones into a phased array," she said, her voice a low, urgent hum of discovery. Sheriff Wallace, who stood guard at the van's door with his hand resting on his service weapon, just stared at her. "He's using hundreds of tiny speakers in unison to create a single, powerful, low-frequency broadcast. The radio tower. He's not just using it to send a signal to the phones. He's using it as a massive amplifier for the signal the phones are creating together." She was at her main console, her fingers flying across the keyboard, pulling up the spectral analysis of Finch's override signal. It was elegant, orderly, and ruthlessly efficient. A perfect sine wave of control. "Order can be broken," she whispered. "You don't fight a clean signal with a cleaner one. You fight it with noise." Working with a frantic intensity she'd never known, she began to build her weapon. It was a counter-frequency, but not a cure. It was a jamming signal, a chaotic, multi-layered cascade of discordant tones and erratic frequencies, designed not to heal, but to disrupt. To shout gibberish so loudly that the brain could no longer hear Finch's serene, deadly command. It was a hypothesis she had no time to test, a wild theory she had to deploy as fact. It was an act of scientific faith. "Can you do it?" Wallace asked, his voice rough with tension. "I have to," Lena said, not looking up from her screen. "Buy me 5 minutes at that tower." The drive up the winding hill to the radio relay tower was a slow, surreal journey through a silent river of people. The CDC van crawled forward, its headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the blank, upturned faces of the townspeople as they marched past. They didn't react to the vehicle. They didn't seem to see it at all. They just kept moving, a tide of humanity pulled by an invisible moon. Reaching the tower's chain-link fence felt like breaching the shore of a hostile continent. At the base of the tower was a small concrete control building. Inside, a bank of monitors and a central broadcast console glowed in the dark. As Lena's hands flew over the controls, trying to hijack the broadcast system, one of the screens flickered to life. Alistair Finch's face appeared, as calm and serene as it was in his keynote speech. He was watching them. "They are at peace, Doctor," he said, his synthesized voice smooth as polished glass. "Their anxieties, their regrets, their traumas, all gone. They are quiet. Why would you want to give them their pain back?" "You didn't cure them, you lobotomized them," Lena shot back, her eyes never leaving the console as she fought against his security lockouts. "Pain is a flaw in the code. I am simply debugging the human condition," Finch replied. "You cling to it, to your precious, messy suffering, because you lack the vision to imagine a world without it." "What you call vision is just tyranny," Wallace yelled at the screen. Finch's placid smile didn't waver. The shepherd is not a tyrant to his sheep. Suddenly, a deafening, high-pitched squeal erupted from the tower's speakers. It was a raw feedback loop, a physical assault of sound designed to incapacitate them. Lena cried out, clutching her ears, the sound drilling into her skull. Every nerve ending screamed. Through the waves of pain, she saw a final line of code she had to break. It was a battle of wills, fought with algorithms, and amplified by 100,000 watts of power. Gritting her teeth against the agony, Lena shoved her fingers back onto the keyboard. With one final desperate command, she bypassed Finch's lockout and slammed her palm down on the Enter key. The upload was complete. For a moment, the torturous squeal continued. Then, it was cut short, replaced by a sound that was, in its own way, just as jarring. The tower began to broadcast her signal. It was a discordant, chaotic blast of noise, a symphony of static, a chorus of glitches, the sound of a machine having a seizure. Outside, the river of people stopped. The synchronized march faltered, their lockstep rhythm broken. They stood for a moment, swaying, a collective look of profound disorientation on their faces. Then, one by one, they began to falter. A man clutched his head, a low moan escaping his lips. A woman blinked rapidly, her eyes suddenly wide with a terror that had been absent for days. The blankness was shattering, the ghosts were coming home. Confusion gave way to fear, and fear gave way to the dawning, horrified light of recognition. The spell was broken. On the monitor, Alistair Finch's serene expression finally cracked. His face twisted into a mask of cold, impotent fury. The screen went black. Dawn broke a few days later, painting the bruised sky in shades of lilac and rose. Havenwood was quiet again, but this time, it was a different kind of quiet. It was the heavy, fragile silence of recovery. People moved slowly, talking in hushed tones, comforting one another. They were piecing together their lost time, grappling with the raw, messy, painful reality of who they were. It was not a happy ending, it was a human one. Lena stood with Sheriff Wallace on Main Street, watching. A convoy of black government SUVs was parked near her van. Dr. Bellamy and his team were here, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief, already drafting the reports that would frame this impossible event in safe, bureaucratic language, no doubt taking their share of the credit. Lena ignored them. She held the phone from the teenage girl's bedside. She looked at the sleek, elegant icon for the Clarity app, the simple cyan sound wave that hid a universe of horror. With a deliberate final movement of her thumb, she deleted it. She looked up from the small screen to the town itself. She no longer saw an outbreak zone, a data set to be analyzed. She saw a complex, fragile, and beautifully flawed network of human minds, each one a universe of memory and pain and love. She had not abandoned her science. She had expanded it. She had learned that the human soul could not be measured on a spectral analyzer, but that its erasure was a threat that science had to be brave enough and creative enough to fight. There's something incredibly seductive about the initial promise of the Clarity app, isn't there? In our own lives, we're constantly looking for ways to quiet the noise, to manage the stress, to declutter our minds. The story takes this very modern desire and pushes it to a terrifying extreme. What's so compelling is that the antagonist, Alistair Finch, isn't just a typical villain. He wraps his terrifying weapon in the language of wellness and spirituality. He offers a kind of salvation. He presents us with a deeply uncomfortable question. Is our memory, with all its associated pain and trauma, truly worth keeping? He sees it as a disease, and he has a cure. For a moment, you can almost understand the appeal of his twisted logic. Who wouldn't want to erase their deepest regrets or their most painful moments? But Dr. Hanson's journey shows us the other side. She uses the tools of science not just to uncover a conspiracy, but to defend the very essence of a messy, complicated, and often painful human experience. She fights to give the people of Havenwood their suffering back, because it's intertwined with everything else that makes them who they are. It forces us to wonder where the line is between healing and erasure. So, I'll ask you, if you were offered Finch's cure, a life completely free of your past pains and traumas, would you take it?